In April 1945, Germany was nearing its end. The front lines were collapsing, orders were sporadic, and the roads were filled with retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians. In the Westphalia region, amid the chaos, a 19-year-old private named Klaus Brenner was hiding in his worn-out uniform. On a deserted road, Brenner came across an abandoned military vehicle. Inside was a complete Wehrmacht officer's uniform with rank insignia. In just a few minutes, the deserter transformed in a Hauptmann, or Captain Brenner of the 4th Reconnaissance Battalion, as he called himself. Exploiting the chaotic military command structure, he fabricated a story about a direct order from the highest command, recruited a motley group of gunmen along the way, and began to act as an officer with the power of life and death. From a moment he put on the officer's coat, Brenner did not just switch identities. He exploited the Third Reich's final power vacuum to grant himself absolute authority. In the following days, he arrived at Camp Belsen-Nord, where his fake authority quickly turned into a brutal instrument, leaving behind a record of crimes that were shocking even in the final weeks of the war. Klaus Brenner, from a young man to a deserter. Klaus Brenner was born on the 3rd of October, 1925 in the town of Erfurt in Thuringia, Germany. Coming from an ordinary working-class family, Brenner's childhood was intertwined with a Germany spiraling into economic crisis and the rise of the Nazi regime. Like many young people of his generation, the boy Brenner was soon influenced by the propaganda and youth organizations controlled by the Nazi Party. In his teenage years, Brenner joined the Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, where adolescents were trained in discipline, physical fitness, and loyalty to the regime. After leaving school, Brenner apprenticed as a blacksmith, a common labor job, but it was only a brief stepping stone. When World War II broke out, Brenner was among the young Germans who came of age to enlist. In 1943, at the age of 18, Brenner joined the army and was assigned to the reconnaissance units, Aufklärer, an elite force of the German Wehrmacht. Being chosen for the reconnaissance unit reflected Germany's urgent need during the escalating war rather than a special selection based on ability. Brenner underwent military training and was deployed to the Western Front, where German forces were fighting off the Allied advance. However, like many young recruits, Brenner did not have a distinguished military record. Records indicate that his service was relatively brief and left no mark on the Army. By February 1945, as the war entered its final phase, Brenner was separated from his unit during a chaotic retreat. This was a time when the German army had lost control of many fronts and desertion was widespread. Brenner, just 19 years old at the time, became one of tens of thousands of soldiers who lost contact or fled. The turning point came as he was wandering, looking for a way, when Brenner came across an abandoned military vehicle containing a German Wehrmacht captain's uniform. Hauptmann Wehrmacht. Instead of continuing his journey as a regular deserter, Brenner made a decision that would completely change his fate. He put on the uniform and impersonated a high-ranking officer. This event was more than a random act. In the chaotic context of the Third Reich's final days, when the control system had disintegrated and military discipline had all but vanished, a uniform and an officer's title were enough to create a false sense of authority. Brenner understood this, and from an anonymous private, he transformed himself into Captain Brenner, a fictional character who was able to manipulate both soldiers and prisoners. This turning point initiated the horrific series of crimes Brenner committed in just a few short weeks, turning his name into a symbol of the chaos and violence in the final days of the war in Europe. Klaus Brenner and Belsen-Nord Camp. On the 9th of April 1945, just weeks before Nazi Germany's surrender, Camp Belsen-Nord, a prison camp within the Westphalia region near the Dutch border, fell into chaos. This camp was a holding place for German soldiers convicted of desertion or other disciplinary violations. In the final phase of the war, as numerous units disbanded, the number of prisoners here increased rapidly, while the management force became undisciplined and disorganized. In that situation, Klaus Brenner, a 19-year-old deserter, appeared at the camp. He wore a Wehrmacht captain's uniform he had found in an abandoned vehicle and introduced himself as Captain Brenner of the 4th Reconnaissance Battalion. To establish his authority, Brenner claimed he had been directly entrusted by Hitler with the task of investigating and punishing deserters, and that he had absolute power. The atmosphere of confusion and fear among the camp's management meant no one dared to question his words. The camp command, which lacked a strong leader, quickly handed over control to Brenner. In just one day, from being an anonymous deserter, Brenner became the most powerful figure at Belsen-Nord, holding the lives of hundreds of prisoners in his hands. In the very first roll call, Brenner asserted his rule through violence. He randomly selected a number of prisoners and ordered their public execution as an example. These shots were not just meant to eliminate a few individuals, but also to terrorize and control the entire camp. Just one day later, on the 10th of April, 1945, Brenner orchestrated one of the bloodiest mass executions in the camp's history. Around 89 prisoners were selected for execution. They were forced to dig their own mass grave under the close supervision of Brenner and his accomplices. The prisoners were then executed in a mass shooting, and some victims were even thrown into the pit with grenades to ensure no one survived. In the following days, from April 9th to 17th, Brenner continued to order the execution of several other smaller groups. The shootings were carried out systematically, not as impulsive acts. Prisoners were often gathered, sorted, and then led to the execution ground. It is estimated that during the short period Brenner controlled the camp, between 142 and 164 people were killed. Belsen-Nord Brenner's Bloody Cemetery on the 17th of April, just 3 weeks before Nazi Germany surrendered Camp Belsen-Nord, became the target of a Royal Air Force bombing raid. The bombs destroyed many of the camp structures, including the prison blocks and auxiliary facilities. The air raid killed about 60 prisoners instantly. The remaining prisoners were thrown into chaos. Some took the opportunity presented by the destruction and the guards' inattentiveness to escape. This event brought Klaus Brenner's brief reign of power at Belsen-Nord to an end. The prison camp was almost completely disintegrated, no longer able to operate. However, the consequences of Brenner's actions could not be hidden. After the war, when Allied forces excavated the area, they discovered nearly 180 bodies in mass graves, most of them victims of the executions ordered by Brenner from April 9th to 17th. The bodies were later reburied at a war cemetery, which local residents hauntingly refer to as Brenner Cemetery. It serves as both a memorial to the victims and a vivid testament to one of the final crimes of the Nazi regime. What makes this event particularly tragic is its nature. The massacre did not occur on a battlefield against an enemy, but was directed against German soldiers who were themselves considered guilty merely for deserting or committing disciplinary violations. In less than 2 weeks, a 19-year-old in a fake uniform transformed into a self-proclaimed judge with the power to decide the fate of hundreds of people. Camp Belsen-Nord thus became a symbol of the extreme chaos in the final days of the Third Reich, when authority was no longer based on state structure, but could be seized and abused merely through impersonation and violence. Brenner from prison camp to bloody village after the bombing raid on the 17th of April 1945, which almost completely destroyed Camp Belsen-Nord. Klaus Brenner did not disappear with the camp, but continued his violent path. He left the area with a group of about a dozen people, including deserters, looking for refuge, and some prisoners who were released or voluntarily followed him. These were individuals in a state of chaos and disorientation, and Brenner used his Wehrmacht captain's uniform to maintain the illusion of authority. Presenting himself as an officer directly authorized by Hitler, Brenner transformed this small group into a semi-official armed squad. Lacking any legal authority, but armed with a uniform and a brutal demeanor, he easily intimidated villagers and even disorganized military units. In the context of April 1945, when a Nazi state's order was rapidly collapsing, the image of a young officer acting with decisiveness was enough to convince many people to believe in his power. Brenner's group moved through villages and towns in the Westphalia region and surrounding areas, carrying out arrests, searches, and punishments based on Brenner's personal whims. With no legal process or military orders, all decisions were made and executed by him on the spot. Post-war documents reveal that in late April 1945, Brenner's group caused more deaths outside the prison camp. One recorded incident was the execution of 4 Belgian citizens on suspicion of being spies or having ties to the resistance. No evidence or interrogation procedures were presented. The executions were directly ordered by Brenner and carried out immediately. At another location, his group hanged a German merchant just for hanging a white flag in front of his house, an act intended to signal surrender to avoid casualties as the Allied forces approached. In Brenner's eyes, this was considered treason and a death sentence was carried out without any trial. These events clearly demonstrate how Brenner extended his pattern of violence from the prison camp to civilian society. He exploited the final state of anarchy to impose his false authority and continued his arbitrary violence under the guise of executing military orders. Rather than being impulsive acts, these incidents reflect his deliberate and calculated nature. Brenner sought to maintain his position of leadership by sowing fear and asserting his power through public murders. Brenner from escape to downfall. On the 28th of April 1945, just a few days before Nazi Germany's surrender, Klaus Brenner was captured by the German military police. He was arrested on suspicion of impersonating an officer and abusing his authority, an act that was considered a serious crime in the German military. In the initial interrogation, Brenner continued to use his Wehrmacht captain's uniform and fabricated a story that he was an officer given a special mission directly from high command to deal with cases of desertion. With confidence and a resolute tone, he tried to create the impression that he was executing an urgent order in a time of national chaos. Notably, although the truth about Brenner's false identity was not difficult to uncover, he was released after a short period of detention. Post-war records and testimonies show there was intervention from some officers or officials of the German Navy. The exact reason was never fully clarified, but the context of the time can offer some explanation. In late April 1945, the German state apparatus was in a state of collapse, and the legal system and military discipline were almost paralyzed. In that chaos, many cases were no longer handled properly, and Brenner exploited this loophole to escape immediate prosecution. After being released, Brenner did not return to his old group of accomplices. Instead, he quickly separated from them, abandoned the title of Captain Brenner, and reverted to his real name to get new identification papers. His goal was to legitimize his identity in a society that was falling apart and to avoid the attention of the approaching occupying forces. In this context, Brenner went back to the trade he had learned before enlisting, a blacksmith, as a way to hide his past and pretend to be an ordinary citizen uninvolved in the massacres. However, this attempt at reintegration was very short-lived. On the 21st of May 1945, less than a month after his temporary release, Brenner was arrested by the British forces in northwest Germany. The irony was that the initial reason was for a petty theft. He was accused of stealing food rations. Yet, this seemingly minor incident would begin his true downfall. During the investigation, the British authorities discovered many suspicious details about Brenner's past and traced his activities back to Camp Belsen-Nord, bringing justice at last.